with who's going to be leading the Democratic ticket after a tough debate for President Biden. He's staying in. So what are the impacts of all this? So I want to take a look at what's going on in the markets, and then we'll talk a little bit about one of the policies that's been bandied about by candidates in the US and elsewhere on immigration, and then talk about the impact on the markets. So we'll jump right in. But clearly it's a tough time to be an incumbent. Aside from the problems listed here, cost of living is killing people and wages aren't growing fast enough. And you're having this environment where the things that the governments need to do to solve the big problems take a long time, and the populations want immediate gratification. So we end up doing things that solve short-term problems, but leave the big problems still unsolved. Adding to the growth problem, so we're in a low growth problem with bad finances and massive spending needs. You have bad demographics, adding to the uncertainty of who's going to lead and how can they lead. And as fragmented and divided as the political climate is, how do businesses make their investments in that environment? We have the meeting for NATO and 75th anniversary, but what we're finding is a lot of the post-World War II governing institutions aren't really structured for today's world. They were structured for the post-World War II period time, and the world's changed considerably. So are they as valid? How do we update them? How do we make them useful or more useful? And then really the big issue is how does the voters balance their needs against the election hopes of politicians with the hard truths of the economy that we're facing, and how do you balance those two? And I heard a quote from somebody calling it the vacuum of honest policy being put out there. Is how do voters deal in that when they're not getting really much support from either side, the incumbents or the people trying to get in? But this is a real problem that incumbents are facing. I would just say be careful if you win and you're not an incumbent, because the US has a debt problem that is significant. Our net interest costs are projected to exceed our debt spending. But look at the European problem. And as you can see from the chart here, that is going to be very difficult to rein in when the spending needs and demands from the population are so great. And just looking in France right now, and I'm not an expert on France, and I think we'll have somebody who is in a minute, but the French are going to probably undo Macron's raising the retirement age and some of the other fiscal disciplines that he was putting in, particularly depending on the goals of the far left, which are to undo a lot of those, lower the retirement age and do other things. What are the choices that government's going to be left with? And they're only going to be left with three choices really to deal with their economic problems: raise taxes, cut spending, which the governments find hard to do, or in the case of the European nations, exceed their thresholds on fiscal rules, which creates even more political problems for the EU. But at home, we have a similar issue in the US, where how do we rein in our debt and meet all the needs of the population at a time that the needs seem to be growing at a pretty dramatic rate? So what are the remedies that are being put out by both sides, the incumbents and the parties trying to get in? One is halt immigration, because that's been a big problem perception-wise and reality-wise in some countries. We're going to talk in a minute about the possibility of mass deportation in the US, which is something that Mr. Trump has proposed. On the other side, you get that's a far right view. The far left view is tax the rich and tax companies. That way you solve the problem, you give the people what they need, and you can solve the issues that way. But at the same time, we need to increase spending on defense. And at the NATO meeting now, a couple of years ago, we had, I think, 5 or 6 out of the 30 NATO nations, or 29 NATO nations at the time, were at the 2% of GDP target on spending. Today, it's 23 out of the 32 are at that level. But there's a lot of catch up to go on there. There's big spending needs on infrastructure. I think 3 or 4 years ago, McKinsey did a study, and they suggested that globally, the shortfall of funding for the global infrastructure needs was $75 trillion. Add to that the inflation that we had, you can see a $90 trillion bill coming soon for infrastructure needs around the world. And then we have the climate transition and the energy problems that are going to require massive spending. And in Europe, they're worried about how do they match the spending problems like the US has on fiscal spending, whether it's the Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, where we're putting trillions of dollars and attracting money from around the world, companies from around the world to invest with us. Another policy that's been bandied about in the US and Europe is tariffs, particularly on China for concerns about dumping in the auto area, in particular in the EV area with their low-cost cars. Tariffs are inflationary, and that's a problem we're going to have to deal with over time. So you can see the remedies are often problems at the same time that can lead to higher inflation. And most of these will lead to higher inflation because we're not putting the financial discipline in place. And what is that going to mean to rates, and what's that going to mean to dealing with the problems that we have? If we have a bias up in rates, it's going to be very hard for the central banks to cut. Powell's on the Congress today saying it's very unlikely that the next move is a rate increase. However, the policies being put in place or being proposed by the parties, regardless of who wins, will increase spending in most cases around the world. Very hard to rein it in unless we get massive productivity improvements from tech advances in generative AI. And that's a lot of hope and faith before we get the reality of it, because I think the real benefits are going to come a couple of years out. So you can see from these policies, whether it's from the right or from the left, most of them have a lack of fiscal discipline, which will lead towards bias up in rates and more inflationary pressures against what the markets would like of lower rates. And they'll also, in many cases, not encourage the kind of growth you need, particularly if the spending is done by governments where they spread it all around and don't solve the big problems first. I think is one of the big issues that governments and voters are faced with today. So I want to shift gears now to a proposal by former President Trump and his policy on immigration. And immigration is a problem around the world. It's being mishandled in most countries because their policies are not well thought through and they're reactionary to the population rather than the real needs of the country and filling it in. So the Peterson Institute released a report a while back where they looked at the US civilian labor force, and they broke it down, as you can see here. So total labor force is 163 million people, roughly. About 134 of them are US born. 21 million came in legally, and it's about 7.5 are unauthorized immigrants. What's really interesting is when you look at the impact of the populations by sector, and as you can see on the far right, and look at agriculture, look at agriculture here, it's 14% of is the share, and that is significant. So if you deport them, who's going to do the jobs? If you look at manufacturing, it could be upwards of 11, 12%. But the services area is a growing area for it. Anyone who's involved with dealing with caregiving for parents or children know that a lot of the caregivers come in through foreigners, and whether they're legal or unauthorized. So the idea of you just ship them out and that's not going to be an issue, it's politically sounds good, economically could be terrible. And the results that the Pew Research and Peterson Institute came up with on this is just looking at, I think former President Trump said immediately he'd like to deport 1.3 million workers. And the view from the Peterson Institute over 3 years, and this is Adam Posen leading this, who I think is one of the really stronger global economists around the world. He's looking at over a 3-year period, it can impact GDP by 2%, raise inflation by 1.3%. I believe it'll have a significant increase in wage pressures and not solve the problems that we're facing. So I think we need a whole different approach to immigration and mass deportations. I don't think this is a solution. I do think you have to deal with people who are committing crimes differently and they don't get a free pass, but I think you have to find paths to accept workers in, get them trained and get them inculcated into your economy and into your country so that they can be productive members and not make them adversaries and constantly vilifying them, because We have demographic problems in almost every nation in the developed world and many nations in the developing world. And that mismatch is going to be a big problem. And the country that gets this right, I believe, will set themselves apart from many of the others and capture the skills and the talent needed to grow and thrive in a very difficult environment going forward. So I want to switch gears to the market because we talk about all these problems, yet the markets are hitting new highs, and that's a bit confounding. And I want to talk about some of the opportunities and why we think this is. And this is just a look at the S&P here. And as you can see, the move up from 15 is big significant. Zero interest rates have played a big part of that, but now we're dealing with higher interest rates with, in our view, not a big decline coming in interest rates unless we have severe problems, which we don't anticipate. So I want to talk about some of the reasons why the U.S. markets are doing so well and why the economy is doing so strong. And I'll give you 2 slides to show you. This is household assets by group in the U.S. And as you can see, we're on our way to 175 trillion, and it's moved up considerably since the great financial crisis. But what's interesting is the over 55 group controlling 70% of the net worth in there. And what are they doing and what does their financial status look like? It's very different than the profile of those struggling. And you think about, they paid for their homes. They have either low mortgages or no mortgages. They've moved from the accumulation to the spending phase. So they are spending it out, but they have a lot of money to spend and they're going to be transferring that. But there's something missing that's gone on that's not in these numbers, because this is very important, and that's a big spend group. And some of that's going to transfer sooner because of concerns about sunsetting of the tax provision. So you'll see some transfer going to the younger people now. But this is a massive move of $75 trillion and growing that's going to be shifted over the next several decades. But right now it's in the control of people who can spend and spend pretty freely. But there's something else that happened after the great financial crisis, which happened similar to after the Great Depression, where people had a very different view of debt and they paid down their debts considerably. So right now in the US, debt to disposable income has come down over 3 percentage points in the US over the last decade. And that's put more money in the average person's pocket as well. And that's taken some of the pressures off and allowed spending to continue, even though the excess savings that came from the pandemic benefits have evaporated. So you have strong consumption continuing in the US, which is supported by the government stimulus that I mentioned earlier, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Jobs Act, the CHIPS Act, the National Defense Authorization. All those are spending programs that are multi-year programs that are carrying on, being further supported not just by CapEx, but by state and local governments. But as you look for all the problems in the last couple of years, look at the significant move up in CapEx spending, moving from $5.5 trillion up towards $8 trillion in a 4-year period and continuing to move up. And half of this spend in CapEx today in the US, more than half is on tech and technologies, which are the antidote to inflation as we improve productivity. So I think this is really one of the really interesting dynamics that is carrying the markets right now, but there's an element of fragility that we're going to be dealing with here. So lastly, I want to talk about the Fed put is back on the table, and Powell is speaking today, and he's basically said he doesn't see a big push up in rates. He sees the employment market starting to ease a little bit, soften a little bit, and that is one of the concerns that they have and may give them the ability to move. I don't expect that they'll be moving aggressively in July. More likely, there's a chance they will, but more likely we're looking at September, November timeframe before we see the next move. And if that's the case and things progress the way they are, I suspect that the Fed will be easing, not to deal with the crisis, but to manage or navigate a slowing economy down, which is very different than what they would normally be easing for, which is a panic move and allow them to move slowly. So I just wrap up with, we've only are going to be facing more uncertainty over the next couple months. I think we can expect some more volatility. I think as we move into earnings season, you'll shift from Fed focus after we have the Fed meeting in July. You'll shift suddenly to earnings and the focus on earnings. I think there'll be misses and disappointments because there are some hype up expectations where you can see a pullback that would not be unreasonable. We're up 16% year to date. But inside that, that's on a somewhat shaky foundation. 75% of the move in the S&P for the first 6 months was in the Mega 7, Mega 8 stocks, and the other 493 stocks only added about 4%. But if you annualize 4% for a 6-month return for the full year, you're on track for what is historically normal returns in the equity markets. But I think over the next couple of months, we could see a bit of volatility as you have conventions, the French elections, European elections. You have the rollout of the new UK government, what their programs are going to be, and you have the Republican Democratic conventions, all leading to, and Jackson Hole coming up, all giving you a reason for volatility. I think it's important to keep in mind that the economy is strong, but the central banks don't really have a good idea where the neutral rate should be right now because of the puts and takes that are going on in the economy. Particularly for the Fed, we're running into the problem in the US where we have one foot on the brake with the Fed trying to tighten and fiscal policy accelerating. And that's the Fed's challenge of they're worried about cutting rates and then having to raise them again. It undoes a lot of the work that's been done. And it's not just the Fed, but the ECB has that concern as well. Christine Lagarde mentioned that in June, and I think they're still being very vigilant about that. I think we're in an environment where strong balance sheets, free cash flows are going to matter. You want to play the themes that are going to continue to drive things forward, but you also want to be a little defensive over the next couple of months. I would stay long in the markets, but have some dry powder to deal with the volatility that's coming. So Mark, I'll stop there and open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Stephen. 222 weeks in a row. Adam Blanco, then Sanjeev.
Good morning, Stephen. Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Question regarding that 70 trillion of wealth that is being spent and transferred. I've got two questions on that. How is the Fed calculating that into their interest rate decision, into their decision to cut rates? The second question is, are we seeing that kind of transfer in Europe as well? Large transfer from the older generation to the younger generation?
I don't think the Fed's factored in too aggressively, other than it is speaking to, I think they're spending, not the transfer. It doesn't all get transferred. It's in their pockets till they need to transfer it, right? Death or taxes or estate planning or whatever. So it's there and it's available. But think about of that, you have a lot of people that are just 55 and older that aren't the richest of the rich, that are just in a spend mode because they have the time. So that's part of what's stimulating the economy. So I think the Fed's just viewing it as more consumption, not a big thing that they have to do anything different about. It's kind of an offset to some of the slowing down. So I think that's one of the interesting dynamics there that drives that. As far as is it going on in the rest of the world, I believe that the rich are continuing to get richer everywhere and the poor are seeing that. How that flows through and how that transfers is up. I'm not as clear on. The other thing I would say, though, is I did notice that in France, depending on with the rise of the left again, they were talking about bringing back wealth taxes and things like that, which all those things are on the table now, which creates that uncertainty that I was driving to. And that leads to capital outflows of some significance, as we saw the last time that was discussed. So I think those are some of the things that the Fed's thinking about and worrying about. I think a lot of this brings it back to the US, to be honest with you. A lot of capital, I think, flows back here.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome.
Sanjeev?
Yes, hi. Thank you for the presentation, Stephen. My question is about on the illegal immigrant side. My at least conventional wisdom tells me that they usually hold more than one job. Has that been taken into account when that math? What I didn't understand was the number of hours reduced. Does that take into account the fact that there are multiple jobs?
I'd have to look into that. I'm not sure. I would assume it does because they just look at the job itself. Not how many people are doing it, although they are aware that multiple people are doing multiple jobs these days. Be honest with you, I think it's one of the biggest mistakes the US has made in a long time is not fixing our immigration policy to be more open and more accepting, but to have borders closed to bring people in legally. I've said in the past, I think Canada has a great model for matching skills and jobs and opportunities that you fill the roles that you need. But I can't imagine when we have food problems around the world, what happens to our agricultural supply if we follow through on some of the things we're talking about here. It's just crazy to me. And elsewhere in the world too, it's not just here. I think immigration policies are completely flawed in most nations. And I think it's the Achilles heel of countries that they're not even aware of. And in fact, it's even worse that the politicians are playing to the fears around that rather than the opportunity and the hopes that come with that.
I'm going to put a poll up to see who would like to have us host a deep dive on immigration. Because I think we've been talking about this for a long time when we haven't done it. So I am throwing that. Does that show up for you guys? Save as meeting poll.
No, not in the meeting.
No,
How about now?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it just popped up.
Carry on, Samir.
Yes, thanks, Mark. So a couple of questions, one for Bill, and the second, I guess. So the first is on inflation, right? So I think it was Steve, rather. So you mentioned that because of productivity increases, AI, so on and so forth, that inflation is likely to decrease. I guess my question there is, productivity has already increased, right? If we look at, say, Meta and other companies like that, there have already been a lot of layoffs in the tech sector because we don't need as many programmers anymore. AI is doing, started to do some of that work already, but it hasn't necessarily led to a decrease in inflation. And one hypothesis is that inflation, that a lot of inflation has to do with increase in corporate prices, right? So, you go to the you go to the store, you buy a jar of peanut butter. It's probably smaller than it used to be with the same price or a higher price, right? So, if you sort of expand that up to every other category, it's not. Is it always the case that because of productivity, the inflation will decrease, or is the aspect of corporate, I guess, price gouging independent of that? That's question number one. Question number two, with immigration. So people say that, well, we should have good immigration policies. My question is that with climate change, right? And, so my firm is all about sort of trying to manage climate change. What we're seeing is that with all the heat waves we're having, right? We're having insane heat waves in California right now and other places. That's happening in the poorer countries, right? In the global south. So in Central America, for instance, a lot of crop failures and things like that, which leads people to and water challenges, water stresses, which forces people up here. And short of literally having Trump's wall, I mean, sort of multiplied 100-fold, and machine guns on the borders and literally, I mean, the most extreme measures possible. My question is it feasible to actually manage a real immigration policy, right? I mean, obviously we'd all like to see it, but how long can we hold that off is my question in a world of increasing climate change. So number one, inflation, right? Number two, immigration.
So on inflation, what I should have said or intended to say was that tech and AI, generative AI, are the antidote to inflation when we get the productivity improvements coming. Ironically, for the last decade, with all the tech advances, we've had productivity decline, which is surprising, but the numbers reported show that productivity has come down. I think you're right. You're starting to see with Meta and the tech industry where generative AI is allowing them to do more with fewer employees. I think that takes time to see that benefit spread out so that you see inflation numbers, really the benefits of the inflation offset there. So I think that's part of the challenge, that you have a mismatch of the inflation that's embedded in the system with the improvements in productivity that'll take some time to really come through. And I think there's a hope that generative AI provides that boost, like we've seen other transformative technologies do. but you have to see it come through first for it to really have the impact. And I think a lot of companies won't be as quick to cut staff without seeing the real results yet, because I don't think everyone has a clear view of how they can implement it in their companies to actually lower their costs and improve productivity. So I think that's the challenge, which the Fed can't really, in the near term, do much about. That's where the CapEx spend is going to play through over years, where you spend now and get the benefits in a couple of years. And I think that's how that has to play out. I think controlling the border and all that, and how do you stop the flow of illegal immigrants is a tough question. I don't claim to have great answers for it, but if I was a construction genius, as the former president claimed to be, I would have told Mexico, let's build the border at your southern border, not ours. It's a lot less land and you could defend it a lot easier and stop the flow at that level. I think what you have to do there's real political refugee problems and asylum issues that we have to deal with, but we also have to collectively as a world help these countries that are struggling so much and have a better way to do that. And that's where I was saying earlier that a lot of the governing institutions, the multilateral institutions that came out of the post-World War II period, their mandates are way behind the times for where we are today and the problems we have today. And we need to rethink them and bring them into better productivity for what we're trying to solve them, what their purpose is, and make their purpose more current for the world we're living in today. But the problem of how do you flee a country when you have either political persecution issues or you can't survive because of food and other water or weather problems. These are real and they're going to get worse and we're going to have to deal with it, which is why real policy has to be put in place, not this back and forth of our policy is right, your policy is wrong. There's something between the two sides that they have to find the right answer to.
Thank you.
Paul and Mike?
Yep. Yeah, in line with that question, and with your immigration slide that you showed, Stephen, have you started or other people on your team start looking at the use of humanoid androids and robots? I know you guys are out in Silicon Valley. I don't know what you saw out there, but you're starting to see that in the commercial space. Like if you go to like a Walmart or a Safeway, they have the inventory little robot driving by. You obviously see it in restaurants when they bring food carriers now. It's a little bit of a cute thing, but people are like realizing like the value there. And then the last is like I've seen like very high efficiency janitorial robots that clean commercial bathrooms, and it's amazing like how dexterous these robots are. But like I think that and on the services side, agriculture, we're gonna see this in the commercial space, and we're seeing it now, but it's gonna be widespread in 10 years. In 20 years, like a lot of people are gonna have robots in their houses, like doing things. And so I think that's kind of like a, doesn't go into the, may kind of like affect the need for immigration the way, people are kind of quoting now. They're not thinking about that, but I wanted to see if like you guys have like looked at that part and just seen like what the technology is and what the predictive, kind of effect on immigration is going to be.
It's coming along. You're seeing it in a lot of industries, but it's still early and they're getting used to it. I think there's an element of that that's coming. I was actually just reading a McKinsey paper yesterday on manufacturing sector trying to attract our youths into the manufacturing area to do the jobs, and how can they attract workers in. And they need a different type of worker with different skills because there's more technologies you're highlighting in the manufacturing process. But the manufacturing systems that they have, the production systems, are not ones where leadership and mentorship are big areas, and career advancement is a big area. And it turns out that the issues for young people are when they leave a manufacturing role, which are leaving at a very short turnover tenure, they're leaving. Obviously, wages are one part of it, but it's career advancement and it's leadership with the three things that the young people are highlighting why they were leaving manufacturing roles even though they know it's a good long-term opportunity for them. So I think there's a whole shift that has to go on in the manufacturing sector about how we think about recruiting and talent, what types of talent you're recruiting. And I think it's very different from the Henry Ford line days of the Edsel to where we are today and where it's going to be 10 years from now. So I think you're right. We are looking at it. It's we've looked at some of the robotics companies, and every time you look at them, they're either too pricey or they're not working. And then you take a look away, and then all of a sudden they pop, and then they come back down. So highly volatile area, but we haven't seen. We're looking at it. We haven't seen the real benefits, but we are seeing industries gradually bring it in. I think the fast food area, Chipotle and some others are doing a lot in that area. And I think there's some really Amazon, some really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
But then we have other issues that come with that of how do you what about the lost tax income? How do you get that back? Are they going to be taxing robots now? Are we going to use that to offset some of the fiscal money we're going to have to spend on people who aren't working and all that? So more to come in that area as well.
Thanks.
So Mike, question, then I want to turn to the French elections after, and we'll keep going after that. Mike, go ahead.
Oh, perfect segue. My question was about the American election. Stephen mentioned some turbulent times in the next 3 or 4 months. A lot of chatter about alternatives to Biden. Has anybody heard any chatter about alternatives to 45 for the GOP? Is there a chance neither will be on the ballot in November?
No.
I've not gotten that email.
Now that memo didn't hit my desk.
What is one of the more fascinating things about this, though, is the silence from President Trump, former President Trump, since the debate against his greatest instincts.
Why interfere with chatter that benefits you?
I know, but it's still unlike it's killing him not to say anything. I'm pretty
Well,
sure.
he got caught on that golf cart
Yes.
incident. Well, let's talk. It's not, we're not the only, what happened in France, and Christophe Charlier, if you're on, and again, he's a big friend to the firm. We met each other in our chapter in Russia. He's still a friend, but he was a particular friend when he was the chairman of the Brooklyn Nets, because he hosted us a few times there. But he's been weighing in from time to time, and so the French elections, he explained how it works. Now it worked. It went from the right to the left, or somewhere in between. I don't know. You'll tell us. How should we be thinking about this today?
Yeah, so Mark, this will be actually quite, much shorter presentation than last week, and hopefully you'll invite me again next week, and I can give you some real clarity. President Macron, when he announced this snap election, basically said this would bring some clarity to politics, and it's done everything but. A lot of people were expecting the far right to do much better than it has, but if you remember our discussion last week, I mentioned that we had 310, what we call in French, triangulaires. So these were districts where 3 candidates were present. Well, about 220 of those, the third candidate, who was either someone from the left or someone from the center, basically withdrew from the race in order to make sure that the far right would not win. So the result of that has been that the party getting the most votes is the left, the Nouveau Front Populaire, which has about 33% of the seats in the new assembly. The center has about 30% of the seats in the assembly. And the far right, which was hoping to get enough to have an automatic prime minister, I think barely broke 25%. So the result of that is, no one won the election, but France lost. We're going into a pretty chaotic period. So the prime minister, as is the tradition, not the rule, officially tendered his resignation on Monday following the results. The president asked him to stay on for the good of the country and to maintain stability during these times. So no one knows exactly for sure how long that will be, but everyone is hoping that it will be at least until the end of the Olympics in September, just so that we can have some continuity while there are some legitimate security risks in France. Then, you know, who will become the new prime minister? It really depends on the negotiations that are, you know, going on since last week and more actively since Sunday evening, to determine who is going to partner with whom in order to put together a coalition that has more than 50% of the votes. And at this point, I think, you know, the good news that it's certainly not going to be someone from the far right. It's not going to be Mélenchon on the far left. It will be somewhere in the center. And the question is it going to be Gabriel Attal who gets that task once again, or is it going to be, or someone like him, or is it going to be someone from the socialist camp? So it's, you know, early in the week to tell, but if I get the invitation next week, I hope to continue the narrative next week.
You have the invitation, but at least someone's going to be older than 28 years old, it looks like.
Yes.
And younger than 80.
Yes.
Any questions to Christophe or others, comments on, I mean, the French elections and there are other European elections that are of interest?
Christophe, what does this mean for businesses these days? How are they reacting to this in terms of investments, making capital spends?
You know, this is all very new, right? We're on Tuesday. The results came in on Sunday. They were a real surprise that the far left did so well. You know, you talked about capital flight, and you know, if we end up with a socialist or a far left government, you know, I think that's a real possibility. They're already talking about bringing back the wealth tax, increasing taxes, taxing the rich, bringing back very punitive inheritance taxes and things like that. So, you know, it could be meaningfully negative if the far left somehow finds a way to take the prime minister's position. If what I hope and expect will happen, some kind of coalition going from the socialists, the Macronists, and part of the Republicans come to an agreement, and we have more of a center government, I think will basically be, you know, in kind of a stalemate, not much going on. And, you know, business would most likely be at least more okay with that than either the far right or the far left. So it's probably not that bad of an outcome.
Thank you.
Samir?
So I had a question on that, which is after World War II, right? The marginal tax rates in the US were at 92%, right? Either after or you know, during FDR's time, so on and so forth. I mean, that was a time of fantastic growth for the US, right? So I guess my question is, no, you know, that wasn't it considered sort of as this golden age, or you know, time when like a whole lot happened or whatever, right through the 70s, right? You know, right until Reagan, you know, when things started to drop. We had pretty high tax rates, right? But it didn't seem to stop us in terms of the innovation and all the stuff we were doing. So I guess my question is it always the case that, you know, if you have these high tax rates, or is it to do with, you know, innovation? Is it to do with other factors that are more important than, you know, these high marginal tax rates, which ultimately apply to a relatively small portion of the population, right? You know, compared to the majority of spenders. So thoughts on that?
I don't know if Christophe want to take that on.
Yeah, I'm not an economist, but you know, let me give you my view on that. It's a very different situation where, you know, at that time the U.S. was, you know, and probably still is, the greatest country in the world with the greatest economy, the greatest growth, and coming out of World War II, significant, you know, momentum. France, unfortunately, you know, we were in that position maybe 2 centuries ago. We're not in that position in 2024. And there's a lot of alternatives for capital flows, you know, to be invested other than France. So if we get those high marginal tax rates, the high wealth tax, you'll see people, you know, looking at alternatives in, you know, Spain, Germany, Italy, Belgium, and the UK.
Well, also the US, there's several French families who moved in the 80s to the US.
Yeah, including my family.
There you go.
And I think I mentioned this last week, but there are more unicorns, that were created by French people in the US than in France. So, there's a real risk. There's a real flight of talent and of capital risk in France, which I think wasn't as much of a case in the US after World War II.
We also had massive pent-up investment needs and a re-entry of the workforce as guys came back from the war. And we started building out massive homes and massive home building and all that you're not going to be doing in France at this time. So it's a very different setup than it was then.
So Adam, if you
I
don't
agree.
mind, I want to let Michael and Bill go because they haven't asked a question yet, let alone 2 questions. Michael.
Okay, so just to comment on Samir's question. Post-World War II, most of the economies around the world were in shambles. And so to, say, oh, well, high tax rates and the economy was good. The economy was good because the US was producing for the world, essentially.
Yeah.
So that's my response to that comment. But Christoph, my question about the elections, I saw somewhere that it was a record turnout. Do you have any insights as to who came out? Was it new voters? Was it voters that had been sitting on the sidelines? What was going on there?
So my understanding, just to put some numbers around it, it was 66% participation, which is quite high for legislative elections. You get those numbers for presidential elections, but much less for legislative ones. My understanding, and I don't have the facts in front of me, but my understanding is that it's voters that usually feel that their vote doesn't make a difference. In the last 3 weeks since Macron announced the snap elections, we were hammered the message from the far right, the far left, and the center that this was a very consequential election, and so people who've been sitting on the sidelines for a few years came back.
Thank you.
Bill?
Yeah, thanks, Christoph. I mean, obviously, very interesting that both UK by a substantial majority put Labour in, and now we see France. Do you see, is this sort of a groundswell that is happening, and do you see it as being further alignment across greater Europe with a more left perspective?
So I think the two elections are very different. In the UK, there was a proper swing towards the Labour Party after so many years of the Tories being in power. So I think there it's a true support for the Labour's policies. In France, it has more to do with the fact that we've got 4 blocks really, the left, the center, the right, and the far right, which are pretty much divided into thirds. And if you look at the center right, far right, as quote unquote a block, you get more than almost 70% of the country voting for someone other than the socialists and the far left. So there isn't the same support for left-wing policies in France as there is at this moment in the UK. At least I don't think you can read that from these 2 elections.
Thank you.
All right, Adam. Or sorry.
Yes. Christoph, my question is for you regarding European leadership, global leadership. Macron has been seen as the leader of Europe after Merkel left. Is that still the case? And who do we call in Europe?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point. Macron's getting a lot of flack these days because he's still planning to attend the NATO meeting while we, are still in limbo here in France politically. I think this is part of his effort to show that, he's still meaningful both internationally and particularly in European and NATO discussions, particularly having to do with Ukraine and Israel. So I think he's going to keep trying to maintain that role. I don't see either the incoming UK Prime Minister or Germany overtaking him in that position. But clearly, I think his voice is weakened from his poor showing in these elections.
Thank you, Christophe.
Any more questions on France or Europe or anywhere else? Usually every briefing turns to China at some point. We haven't talked about China yet.
Well, if I made one last question for Christophe, and that is the demographics of the French elections in terms of age. Do you have any insight on that? The younger generation versus the older generation, and where their support is going.
So I would say there's two trends to mention here. One is age, and the second is having to do with the growing Muslim population and where their affinities are going. So I think a big part of Mélenchon's support has been coming from the Islamic community in France. And, that's going to be a growing trend. And if he continues to speak to that community, his voice will continue to grow. Mélenchon, as a reminder, he's part of the Nouveau Front Populaire, so the left side. He's the extreme left. And he has about 80 seats out of 577. So what's that, about 15%, right? So it's quite a meaningful stake. In terms of the older population, I had an argument with one of my friends who was in Macron's government, is still for a few more days or weeks. He felt that the older generations would support Macron. My sense is that the older generations, after years of flirting with the far right, are closer and closer to voting that way. So I think it's a real meaningful challenge for the next 3 years for Macron and the moderate right to get the older voters back.
Thank you.
And a lot of that has to do, frankly, with a sense of insecurity, tied to mainly violence, which correctly or incorrectly is blamed on high immigration.
Yeah.
Andy, Fish?
Obviously it hasn't gone this way so far, so Macron is still there. But let's say Le Pen ended up in his shoes. Given all that fear in Italy a few years ago about the right, a lot of what we've seen is that people say things, and then once they're actually in power, the things that they can and can't or will or won't do are quite different. So we're talking about, you were mentioning before about rolling back some of the things Macron did. So in the instance where Macron does not have power and Le Pen's party does, what type of things do we think would actually happen versus the talk that led up to the election?
Well, look, the good news is that even if somehow the Rassemblement National is able to organize itself and get the prime minister's position, their control, of the parliament is minuscule, right? So at least for the next 3 years, that just can't happen. And even if they do get prime minister, not having the parliament, none of their laws will be put in place. The bigger risk is in 3 years, right? In 3 years, we've got the presidential election and a new legislative election, where if they continue their trajectory and the left and center blocs are not able to unite and to fight against them, then you can have Le Pen as president, Bardella as prime minister, and the far right controlling parliament, and then it's a very different ballgame. Because if they can control all three, then they can meaningfully put in place their anti-immigration and other far right policies that they've already announced. On the economy, the risk is that they're very inexperienced and very populist in their economic views, and so it would just be, I think, very populist views that they would put in place. They've announced, for example, blocking prices, reducing tariffs on essential goods with no understanding of how they're going to finance that.
Any other?
Thanks.
Thanks, Andy. Andy, we got to see you in Newport. Did you get off the fence yet? Need a ride?
I still don't know yet.
Well, you know, Christoph didn't know if he was coming to our New York conference until like a few days before, right? You're trying to figure your.
I only live an hour and 15 minutes from Newport. It's not
Well,
the point.
but he was in Europe and he detoured to the inaugural conference in 2018.
Yeah, and Mark, I remember the expression you were trying to remember last week. It was irrational belligerence.
Yeah, I guess it was, you know what, it's so interesting. When you think of the Trump themes, there was a lot against China at the time, which we thought that was the first time anybody's talked to China like that. And now Biden is tripling down on that. And the narrative, and we were talking about, I don't know if there was another election, because we can't, in any event, it was, there's some interesting things. Yeah, then Africa, that whole narrative, because that was where it was coming from, partly because you were focused on Africa at the time. I think that narrative is shifting. And there's partly because of enlightenment, 25 years overdue of the upstream metals and minerals that are needed for the future economies. But we didn't record those sessions. Now we have I just so everyone knows, we have 1,000 hours and 900 events that have been recorded thanks to Zoom. And in Newport, we'll have interviews on the side, right? But the beautiful water.
And Mark,
Otherwise, yep.
I noticed Hamlet was on. Can we ask for 2 minutes on Middle East, Russia?
Oh, that'd be great.
South
That'd
China
be great.
Sea?
Hamlet, you mind speaking to that? I saw him on. Is he still on?
He was on just a minute ago. I was just curious to get his quick take if he is available. He's on mute.
There he is. I'll ask him to unmute. That's the one thing about Zoom, right? That we can always. There he is. Hamlet, we love your opinions on just how you're seeing the world, particularly in light of the conflict in the Middle East, the elections in Iran, right? Talking about elections. Can you speak to that?
Sorry, Mark. Was that geared towards me?
To you, yeah. I guess Stephen Berkowitz saw that your comments, and it says Middle East, but also the other election. How to make sense of it?
The Iran election specifically?
Right.
Yeah, I mean that obviously is going to come with a ton of bias on where I stand with the regime, but I think the thing that the media is grossly getting wrong is they're calling Pezeshkian a reformist or a moderator or a regime outsider. That's all a load of bull. Iran does not have free and fair elections. To quote Lenin, the best way to control the opposition is to be a part of it. So I think what we've seen with some of the prior presidential or presidents we've had coming out of Iran, potentially going back to Khatami, they've all been kindler faces that the regime has given us, the West, because it's trying to extract certain things. Rouhani and Zarif were not reformists. They were not moderates. They were English-speaking and more gentler souls after Ahmadinejad, which paved the way for JCPOA, which was a nuclear deal. From that, we got Raisi. Raisi is obviously a true and true hardliner. It just so happens after he dies, Iran is getting dangerously close to having nuclear breakthrough. They're getting ready to go through their own succession planning. So I think the Iranian regime needed a kindler, gentler face. Pezeshkian is maybe more of a technocrat, but the way Iranian elections work is these guys are chosen by the supreme leader and the council within Iran, which are all controlled by the clerics on who can and can't run. So you're not getting a true reformist. The regime has been set up for decades to basically guarantee its sustainability. So I don't think anybody we're getting there is anything other than what the Iranians wanted us to see. I do think there's a couple scenarios that could come out here. One, obviously, is a big push to some sort of a nuclear deal or some sort of a rapprochement with Iran, which I think would be a bad idea. The other potential scenario is going into the elections here this fall to see a significant escalation in tensions and violence between Hamas and Hezbollah, meant for Pezeshkian to step in as this benevolent reformist to calm matters to a certain extent, and that'll be again Iran's version of trying to get leverage towards some sort of accord, some sort of a deal. The X factor there is, I think, it's what's going to happen when Khamenei dies. That's when I think you're probably going to come the closest to having any kind of change or any kind of a pivot in Iran. But for the near term, I don't expect any change to the status quo.
So what do you see back to Hezbollah and Hamas development? Because you haven't been on here for a while, so how are you seeing
yeah, but it's just been chaotically crazy. But obviously the whole kick up on October 7th, I think, was Iran instigating Hamas to create a division or fissure between Israel and the Arab world. And they wanted to create some space for them to continue to, I think, potentially march down a nuclear path. They were not happy with the direction that the Middle East was going, which is a secularization of the region and rapprochement with Israel. They've always used Hamas, Hezbollah, and Houthis as kind of their proxies and their ability to exert pressure globally. So in terms of what's happening with Hezbollah, I mean, they've, for the most part, I think Israel has significantly degraded a good chunk of the Hamas fighters. They're still kind of buried into a couple of the nooks within Gaza, but the bigger issue right now is some of the more tactical leaders. The strategic leaders are all still hiding out in Qatar, living high on the hog, but the more tactical leaders are in Lebanon. So the question that raises: at what point does Israel then move its sights on tactically and surgically hitting those targets inside Lebanon? I don't think they will until and when Hezbollah gives them a reason to, which is their escalation. I don't think Israel at this point is going to escalate into Lebanon like everyone thinks they are.
So two questions there. And I just saw the amount of arms that Hezbollah has, and then they and what Iran did with that, you know, their response to the bombing and the embassy. It seemed they came out looking so pathetic.
Iran?
Yeah, and yet, and yet what they could have thrown at it is a whole different order.
There's a couple different schools of thought there. One is, I mean, Israel took a shot that, again, I'm of the personal opinion, was justified and needed. They hit 12 IRGC Quds Force commanders, folks from Palestinian Jihad, from Hezbollah and Hamas, are all meeting at an annexed location in Syria. So that's an escalation because it's the first time that Israel actually hit an Iranian government entity, regardless of how you categorize it. So that's escalation there. In retaliation, this was the first time that Iran directly hit Israel inside Israel. Escalation from there, it's the first time Israel directly and overtly hit Iranian targets inside Iran as well. Now, as far as the retaliation against Israel and Israel's attack back against Iran, there's a bit of tarof, or a bit of kind of a Persian culture in there where there had to be some sort of an action. I do think some of it was somewhat known and orchestrated. A couple things to pay attention to is, yes, Iran launched, I think, 350 ordinances into Israel. I think less than 8% got through. I think 30 or 40% of them were some of their advanced mid-range ballistic missiles. I think a third to a half exploded either midair or at the launch pad. So the quality of their work, I think, comes into question. In terms of Israel's reaction back and their retaliation back, they hit specific targets in Isfahan. They hit specific targets at the airport just north of Isfahan. And the reason this is critical is Isfahan and the targets they hit are critical defense nodes just south of Natanz, which is where their nuclear enrichment kind of heart is. So I think that was a very clear message back from Israel, in terms of, hey, if we want to come in, we can. The issue with that, though, is I think the Iranians deep down inside know that the capability from the West is there to come in there and hit targets deep inside Iran if we wanted to or if we needed to. But I think Iran are the ones who basically taught Hamas the tricks of the trade, which is if you're afraid of being taken out by an overmatched force, one of the things you do is you hide your critical infrastructure, your resources, your armaments deep under civilian infrastructure, churches, or in this case, mosques, hospitals, civilian centers, schools. So this is what makes the issue of any kind of a long-term strike back against Iran from a nuclear standpoint or nuclear deterrence standpoint not on the table, because the Iranians aren't putting their nuclear arsenal out in the open for the Israelis or the Americans or anybody else to reach out and hit. They're burying the stuff deep underground, which makes the issue much more complicated. The problem with Iran right now is kind of the toothpaste is out of the tube. Iran's going to become a nuclear power in the near future. It's not a matter if they can get there. They've already proven the technical know-how of how to enrich uranium to weapons grade. Now it's a matter of time and resources to get there. The question becomes is who do you want in charge of Iran? What government is in charge of Iran when they become a nuclear state? Is it the current regime, which is absolute hardliners who believe in the Mahdi sect of Shia Islam that believes in their version of revelations? Or do you want the oligarchy and the kleptocracy in power? Does that get you anything better? Or is there a potential for an actual reformed Iran led either by the crown prince or technocrats or whatever? The latter, I think, is the pipe dream. It's where we want to eventually get to. I don't think we're getting there anytime soon because the regime in power inside Iran, like I said, has absolute control and authority right now.
Yep. All right, there's a crash course in the Middle East by Hamlet Yusuf.
2 hour
Adam-
brief in 2 minutes.
Adam's got
Thank
a
you. Awesome.
question.
I did have a question, Mark, about, can you give us your quick take on Russia and Ukraine and how the next couple months might play out there? What you're looking for there?
Yeah, look, I think you're going to see a significant escalation in Ukraine. I've been writing about it for years. I think Putin is going to go all in at this point to try to lock in his gains from a territorial standpoint, because he's getting ready for one of two things. He's getting ready for a Trump presidency, where Trump is going to come in and say, all right, let's all put our arms down and kind of walk away for a bit, and you keep what you got and we'll figure it out. Or this is going to be a continued effort for him to beat down the will of the West politically to want to fight, to want to continue to support Ukraine and get to some sort of a near-term armistice. Either way, he wants to control as much turf as possible. So when he does have to negotiate and give some pieces back, he still gets to keep what he wants, which is Crimea, and which is the land bridge to Crimea, and which is the Donbass. The question with that tactic, though, is if you give Putin those lands, is he done? And we're back on a path to global peace? Or is this the beginning of Putin's aggression in terms of reconstituting Soviet empire or Soviet influence back along the lines that was there in the 20th century? All bias considered, I think Putin is in the beginning stages of his master plan, which is continue to expand Soviet influence. If you thought Putin only wanted Crimea and Donbass because of Russian heritage and that's it, then why is he doing what he's doing in Armenia and Georgia right now? He is looking to expand his influence in the region. He is looking to create buffers across the south and to the west. If he just wanted old Russian land back, then he would leave Georgia and Armenia alone. That's not the case. That's why I'm not crazy about appeasing Putin in the near term.
How is Ukraine set to fight back right now?
They're not. I mean, they have exactly what they need to continue what we have, which is a prolonged bleeding of both sides. And Putin knows that, but also Putin, pretty good at math. Ukraine or Russia has a 5-to-1, 7-to-1 advantage in terms of military age male and fighting force. So it doesn't matter how good they are. He has more to throw at the problem. And that's how Russia fights their wars. They fight it through attrition. They fight it through just throwing fodder into the front lines. And I think that's what you're seeing right here.
To that point, I can't remember about how 1,200 soldiers. I don't know if that was daily that the Russia's losing, or was it even more rapidly? And how much is and what is it on the Ukrainian side, so, on this war of attrition?
That's the number that no one wants to throw out there. Now offensively, you're going to lose more people when you go on the offense. You're going to lose less people when you're entrenched and on defense. So Ukraine did well when they were entrenched and they were basically bleeding out the Russians when they're throwing people into the problem. But if you want to get Putin out, if you want to get Russian forces out of Donbass, out of Crimea, I just don't think that Ukraine long term has the manpower to do that, let alone the armaments. Now we're starting to trickle in more and more support from an armament standpoint, but I just don't see how Ukraine is going to be resourced properly to wage a proper offensive campaign to push Russia out of the lands they're in right now. So I think that what that leads to is eventually you're going to get to some sort of a truce, some sort of a near-term armistice, whether that's driven by a new administration that wants to limit funding, or if that's just a simple breaking of the will. We're heading in that direction. The question becomes is, again, what's Putin's moves beyond that? Is it the eventual move on Odessa? Is it the eventual annexation of Moldova? Is it then doing what he does well, which is asymmetric irregular warfare and creating distrust and chaos within the Ukrainian government? So Zelensky falls and he gets his own proxy in there. So that's what plays out over the next 2 to 4 years. Once we get to some sort of an armistice, whether it happens in 4 months or in the next 12 months. But I think that's where we're going right now.
Thank you very much. Awesome.
Yeah.
So Andy and Michael.
Hamlet, one quick one, well, two quick ones. One, doesn't Putin just need to keep pushing pretty much forever to stay in power, regardless of what happens, Ukraine, Georgia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But I was more to thinking, when you said that the Israelis escalated by hitting the Iranians in Syria, isn't that a result of the Iranians basing themselves openly in places like Syria? And
yeah, but
any other
the
places?
difference here though is Iran has been in Syria for over a decade, and Israel has been regularly schwacking IRGC, Quds Force, and Iranian proxy targets throughout Syria for a decade. This is the first time they hit an actual embassy annex. Now, it wasn't the embassy, it wasn't during business hours, it was a bunch of innocent diplomats didn't get killed. It was actual IRGC commanders, but it was a facility that was annexed to the embassy, which technically makes it sovereign Iranian territory. So it's the first time they've hit that directly towards an Iranian target. They've hit Iranian IRGC safe houses and facilities all day long, but this is the first time that I think it was a true Iranian government target.
Yeah. Michael Hammer.
Hamlet, in your opinion, what's the risk of the Russian-Ukraine war spreading, given the hybrid attacks, cyber attacks that the Russians are engaging in Western countries?
Yeah. Look, the war has already spread in terms of cyber attack, information warfare. That's already happening. The fear here obviously is how much more kinetic does this become outside of Ukraine. Near term, I don't think it spreads outside of Ukraine. Midterm, long term, it's the reason why Poland is ratcheting up their defense spending. It's the reason why NATO woke up. Is they're starting to worry what Putin's going to do beyond just Ukraine. They don't think this is hey, we're going to take Ukraine and call it a day and global peace is going to break out. That's not happening anytime soon. So if it gets to the point where we start putting actual additional boots on the ground, when I say we, I'm not talking about the US, I'm talking about just the allies in general, then you run the risk of this thing escalating pretty quickly. If we get into a direct conflict with Russia, and the West is pulled into it, NATO's pulled into it, and the US is pulled into it, I think we if we wanted to, we could significantly degrade Russian forces, but that triggers obviously a much bigger conflict. That begins to push Putin into the corner. Now, whether Putin ever goes for the kill switch and actually goes tactical on his nuclear arsenal, or does anything like that, that's a point that's up for debate right now. I personally don't think Putin goes nuclear. I think he will threaten it, and I think he will bolster it, and I think he'll go Mad King theory, just like Trump and Reagan did against him, or against the Soviets. But I don't think he's going to go nuclear because he wants to go out as Putin the Great. He wants to have legacy kind of remember him for expanding Russian influence. Lighting the world on fire and starting a nuclear war is not a way to do that. And I got to think there's enough controls in and around him that if he ever did go down that path, there's gonna be enough people that'll get in the way of him actually clocking that off, because these are people who got families and wives who don't want to die. But I think Putin is going to continue to play that card aggressively as a means to get appeasement and a settlement in the region.
So Hamlet, the way modern warfare and armament has been evolving rapidly, particularly with drones, UAV, different types, both sometimes by sea. How do you're in the business of investing in companies with dual use technologies? I mean, everything 3-4 years ago, everything was fintech. Even a swimming school was a fintech company.
Yep.
Now everything's dual use, deep tech. We have some interesting companies basically that all they're doing is arming Europe right now for drones.
Yep.
Where do you see the opportunities for investing in this dual use environment today?
Yeah, I mean, shamelessly speaking, that's our thesis. We're a dual use defense focused fund. We invest in early stage VC funds and companies that are basically investing in building the deep tech companies that are playing a part in this. We have multiple portfolio companies right now that have been critical in Ukraine, in Israel, Gaza, as well as the Red Sea. I think what you're seeing is a very, very quick evolution of warfare, where disruptive technologies are going to reshape how we fight. They're going to reshape the doctrine and the ethics and the morality around fighting. You touched on the drone piece. There's been dozens and dozens of drone companies over the last 2 to 3 years who've touted being able to work in a contested GPS environment and be able to operate on the battlefield and be immune to anti-drone technologies. And what we're starting to see is that's not the case. The Russians are bad at the Russians are bad at a lot of things. What they're very good at right now, as it's playing out, is electronic warfare. So being able to kind of deny the airspace. So there's a real arms race between developers on counter drone technologies and drone technologies on what kind of systems and what kind of platforms to get out in the into the battle space. An area that I would pay attention to, though, is as we get further and further down the path of autonomous systems, whether they're ground-based robots, sea-based mesh network of floating or swimming drones, of which we're an investor in both, or just straight drone swarms. At some point, drones are going to go from having pure ISR capabilities or loitering, meaning either looking at targets or having a bomb on the target where a human operator will trigger it to engage, to being AI enabled and edge computing and giving it the opportunity to actually take kill shots at the edge without a human in the loop. That becomes a scary ethical question, because now you have an AI algorithm managing a swarm of drones, making decisions on whether to kill or not to kill. To date, in terms of when we're deploying systems out there, there's a human being in the loop, in the kill chain, who's going to make that final kill, no kill decision. But if the adversary doesn't care about the morals and the ethics, and they're creating platforms that are going to basically go out there and kill any military age male, then you got a significant issue. An early example of this is when you look at kinetic drones or one-way drones. The U.S. and the West is working with Ukraine to develop drones that have one-way capability. They take off and they hit a target, and that target is predetermined. It flies to the target. Think of it as a very accurate artillery shell. Russia right now is not doing that. Russia is partnering with Iran, bringing in these small scale drones that are very rudimentary. They fire 10 or 15 or 20 of them. And just like we saw in Israel, most don't get through, and the ones that do don't always hit their target. So not only are you seeing Russia starting to target civilian infrastructure, critical infrastructure, you're starting to see cases where they're actually hitting civilian targets that aren't part of critical infrastructure. So this is like I said, the beginning of a significant shift in how conflict is fought. On the good side is because we're going down a path of autonomy. Just be crude, the reliance or the need for actual human operators goes down. So you're having to put less quote unquote boots on the ground, but it is changing the face of warfare as we know it.
Back to Adam and Michael.
Yeah, Hamlet, staying on this topic of drones in Iran and Russia, how much of that technology transfer is happening in terms of electronics warfare going to Iran, given that there is an assembly plant in Kazan of Shahed drones?
Yep.
How much of that is being updated and transferred to Iran?
I would say almost all of it. So you guys heard me warn about this 2 years ago. We're going into a second Cold War, and I think we actually have been in a second Cold War for a while since I've been warning you guys. But what that means is just like you have the Soviet bloc and you have the Western bloc, you have now the Western bloc or the I guess modern global bloc versus the China, Iran, Russia bloc, and you're going to see significant sharing of intelligence, of resources, of technology, and IP as well. But I think you're going to see a move, particularly by China, to pull in and create a more of a formidable economic bloc to counter the West, because you're going to get down to the point now, I think, the next couple of years where the global economy is going to 100% bifurcate. You're going to have two different economic blocs, one led by China, one led by the Western world and our Asian allies.
And we're seeing that right now with North Korea and Iran cozying up to China, in which China is buying 90% of Iran's oil.
Yeah.
And byproducts.
Look,
Just
this relationship, everyone's kind of clamoring right now with the growing marriage between China and Russia, and I think everyone's bitching about Modi and his bear hug to Putin that happened today. This is theater. I think if you look at these three critical parts of the BRICS, that is not a relationship that's going to last in the long term. I think at some point, China wants Manchuria back. They want outer Manchuria back. That's a province that was taken by the Russians from the Chinese in the mid-1800s. I think Xi wants that back, and once Russia gets weak enough to a certain point, I think he's going to take that. That's also where a big chunk of the natural resources are for Russia. India at this point has zero love, zero trust for China. Long term, there is no future where China succeeds. The current Chinese Communist Party succeeds as a superpower, and it does not come at India's detriment. So I think that's not going to last. Longer term, excuse me, you're starting to see a greater effort between the West to court India to become more aligned with the West. India is never going to do what the West wants it to do. India is on the path of make India great again. They care about themselves and themselves only, which is fine. I think the solution, though, is to get India to the point to feel comfortable that long term, it is in their best interest to be more aligned with the West and the global order, and not with China or Russia. India sees what's happening in Ukraine. They see that the millions and billions of dollars of arms that they've been buying from Russia probably don't friggin' work. So is that a partner you want to have long term? So that is a separation. I think it's ripe. I think it's going to happen, but also I think plays into the tensions that you're starting to see simmer in the South China Sea.
one question, Hamlet, is this in a Trump regime, he's like, pencils, weapons down. But does that work for Europe? And does Europe have leadership to support Ukraine, in such a Trump scenario?
They're going to have to. they're gonna have to figure this out. I think Trump at this point is continuing to want to push for Europe to take a greater share, and it sounds like what's going to happen. When push comes to shove, is Trump gonna kind of let Ukraine go? I don't think so. I don't think we're gonna go down that path. I could be wrong. I hope I'm not. But I don't think it's going to be a pure let Putin have it. If that ends up happening, then I think that sets us down for a much longer issue. Unless what happens then is Eastern Ukraine then becomes Russia's Afghanistan. It becomes ungovernable, and it becomes a 10-year irregular asymmetric war of attrition that they're going to have to fight. And if that happens, then the potential end result would be the same thing you had with the Soviet Union. The invasion of Afghanistan and the asymmetric warfare that it got kind of bogged down there significantly helped expedite the collapse of the Soviet Union. So if Ukraine, quote unquote, falls, and you have some sort of a prolonged resistance movement inside Ukraine, inside Crimea, and inside Ukraine, you could see that same thing where Russia is now embroiled in a significant soft war on its Western front that's going to dedicate massive resources to. And at some point that leads to Putin's failure. The issue there then becomes is what happens next. I think you see a balkanization of Russia along ethnic lines, which could obviously spill all the way across the east. But the issue there, though, is whoever comes in and replaces Putin, they're not going to be a reformist. They're not going to be a moderate. They're going to be as bad, if not worse. So longer term, that creates an issue because now you have a bunch of factions fighting for power who also have access to nuclear weapons. And that was kind of a big concern during the fall of the Soviet Union, is not knowing who's coming to power, who's going to have access to the Russian nuclear arsenal.
Given the state of the European nations' defense capabilities, which even though they're now getting to the 2% level, they're so far behind, how much can they do to help? I mean, they need to be spending probably 3 or 4% of GDP right now to even get close to having a shot. How do you look at that?
Yeah, they're starting to get there. NATO just launched the NATO Innovation Fund. It's $1 billion meant to be poured into defense tech, defense innovation, and venture. When we started our fund 6 years ago, there was nobody in Europe who gave a shit about national security, defense, and dual use. We just came back from London. There's at least a dozen VC funds out there that we're talking to that are dual use focused, defense focused. There's 4 different credible, reputable funds that are just Ukraine focused right now, that are building defense companies and basically commercializing the technology coming out of Ukraine. I think Eric Schmidt has allocated a significant chunk of capital into kind of not weaponizing, but commercializing and modernizing some of the technology that comes out of Ukraine as well. So Europe is waking up. Is it too late? I don't think so. Because where the European government may not be stepping up at scale, the private sector is. And some of the more, I guess, plugged in families that we've been engaged with and talking to in Europe understand and realize the threat that Europe is facing right now. And they're waking up and starting to allocate at scale into this space.
We have to obviously dedicate a session, and I need to sync up with you, Hamlet.
Yeah.
Is that NATO fund just invested into one of our companies.
Nice.
And every wing of the U.S. military now finally has an accelerator program. I'm sure you're working with some of them.
Yep.
Michael, did you want to ask a question?
Hamlet. So the U.S. and other Western arms suppliers have been restricting the use of weapons, for example, HIMARS, for targets in Russia. Do you see the gloves coming off in that respect?
I think you're starting to see it. I think you're starting to see HIMARS used to hit targets on the fringe across the border. I think just like Putin is pushing our red lines, I think you're going to see some pushing of what are Putin's red lines. If it's a viable military target or piece of critical infrastructure that's supporting kinetic operations inside Ukraine, I think you're starting to see those becoming more viable targets. What I don't think you'll see is actual, obviously, boots on the ground inside Russia. That's an absolute non-starter. I don't think you're going to see live non-Ukrainian boots on the ground inside Ukraine for the foreseeable future. I know Macron in France has talked about it, but again, I think that's pushing red lines. Things would have to fall and degrade significantly in eastern Ukraine for NATO forces to actually go into Ukraine. My guess, my read is at this point, people are happy with the status quo, which is arming Ukraine enough to continue to bleed out and damage and hurt Russia with the hopes of pushing either for some sort of a negotiated truce or some sort of some sort of a breakthrough around Putin's circle. At current trajectory, though, I don't see any organic near term for peace because Ukraine is not going to settle for anything outside of Russia being out of Donbass and potentially out of Crimea. Putin's not going to say, oh, you know what, this didn't work out. I'm just going to pull my guys out and you can have the territories back. We'll go back to pre-2022 lines. Neither side is willing to go there, which means you're going to see an escalation of conflict to get one side to break their will. And whether it's induced by a new administration in the US coupled with pressures from Europe, or whether it's through just atrophy and ability to fight for Ukraine, or whether it's breaking down the will of the establishment to support Putin, because at some point that's going to happen. But the question there, though, is when that does happen, is what are you replaced with? Are you replaced with somebody who didn't think Putin was being maniacal enough? Or are you replaced with somebody who wants to consolidate power and be the king of the oligarchs and just kind of sit back and milk the cash cow of Russia until it goes dry?
Hamlet, could we see North Korean troops as support in the back lines of?
No, I don't think so, because I think Kim Jong-un's got to worry about the South. He's got to realize that the chance of the South coming north are pretty low, but at the end of the day, he can't deploy troops out of there. The person I'm worried least about right now is North Korea. I think the Mad Midget knows what he is. He's this pudgy pretend deity. He's been educated in Switzerland, so he knows he's not the grandson of God. He just knows that he's sitting on top of this hermit kingdom where he is God, and as long as he doesn't mess it up, he's got a pretty good life. Which means he's got to bark when he's told. He's got to saber rattle when he's told, and then he's got to make sure to not push it to the point where South Korea, Japan, and or the U.S. is going to want to come in and do something about it. So I'm least worried about him. I'm not.
Who are you most worried about then?
Iran. I'm most worried about Iran. Simply put, because I told you Putin's not going to go nuclear. Same thing with Xi. Xi's not going to go nuclear. Xi wants to reconstitute the hermit kingdom. He wants to make China the superpower. That doesn't happen when you start World War III and a nuclear war and light the world on fire. North Korea, again, Kim Jong-un does want to mess up a good thing. Why screw this up? The problem with Iran, and I think I said this to you guys a couple of years ago, Iran is ruled by two small factions. They make up maybe 20% of the country. 10% represent the clerical establishment. The other 10% came from the clerical establishment, but are now basically in charge of the economy and the military and the kind of the military industrial complex. They're not overly religious. They care about power. The problem is the religious hardliners are the ones that are in absolute control right now. They have absolute control of the government. They have absolute control of the IRGC. The problem with the absolute or the religious minority, the 10%, is a lot of them come from or believe in the Mahdi sect of Shia Islam, which is almost like of Shia Islam's version of ultra-conservative Christianity that believes in revelations and end times. They think when the world is on fire and the Shia faithful are under threat, you're going to see the return of the hidden Imam and Jesus Christ as a prophet and kind of beginning of their version of revelations, which leads into peace and prosperity. Well, if you have a bunch of people who believe the end times is the natural transition to that next phase of life where things are prosperous for you as a people, that's not who you want to have nuclear weapons, because you actually are not worried about using it because you actually think it might be within your doctrine to do so. Those are the folks that are in power right now. Those are the folks who are controlling the presidency. Those are obviously the supreme leader and the cabal around him.
I mean, like a global civilization jihad.
Yeah, exactly. If you're sitting in a crowded cafe in New York City and a jihadist walks up and wants to clack off in front of you, you're not going to talk him out of the error in his ways. You got to shoot the guy. You got to take him out. You got to address the threat. Same thing here. You have a government right now that if they become a nuclear power, their desire to use it, I think, is entirely on the table. It's no longer just Mad King theory. It's a real threat, real issue. If there's any resolution to the Iran issue, it's making sure that these guys are out of power as soon as possible. Because going back to what I said earlier, Iran is going to become a nuclear state. It's a matter of who's in charge when that happens. I would love it for it to be in the hands of the free people and technocrats. I don't think that's feasible at this excuse me, at this point. But if you can instigate some sort of a conflict between the regime, hardliners, and the clerics, and a bunch of greedy oligarchs and kleptocrats take over, and they have access to nuclear weapons, well, guess what they're not going to do? These are guys who have condos and homes in Switzerland and France and LA and DC and everywhere else. And they don't want to end the world. They want to, they want to continue to milk this thing for what it is. If you're ever going to have a nuclear deal with Iran, that might be the time you do it, because now you can begin to modernize Iran. Now you can start opening up the society. And if you do that, then hopefully within less than a generation, kind of the corrupted powers of Western capitalism, free markets kicks in, and you have a natural transformation of Iran being into kind of the national fold. But fixing Iran, I think, is our single biggest geopolitical challenge for the West, because if we fix Iran, and kind of right size the direction of the regime and take the hard lines out, you take Putin's single biggest arms manufacturer off the table. You take the chief financier for Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis off the table, and you begin to bleed dry the Chinese oil pipeline to a certain extent, and you do, I think, you enable for one thing to happen that most people didn't think was possible 10 years ago, which is a true renaissance in the Middle East. And for those of you who've dealt with the Saudis or the Emiratis in the last couple of years, they're all run by a bunch of 30, 40-something-year-old millennials who don't care about religion, who've gotten numb on the Palestinian issue. They know they have demographics on their side, and they know they're sitting on a powder keg that's ready to explode in terms of a renaissance for the Middle East. They're willing to do that with the Iranians, just not with a regime that believes that it's in their destiny to get rid of the Sunni. That's the big issue right now. So getting rid of or fixing the Iranian issue, I think, is probably our single biggest foreign policy challenge right now.
So again, politics aside, but isn't Trump, how do you see a Trump administration on Iran then?
Full biased. I think Trump was probably one of the better, had one of the better policies on Iran, just putting his foot on their neck and forcing that internal implosion in the country. The issue with the Biden administration is some of the senior figures that are around the Biden administration are also some of the same senior figures that are around the Obama administration. Over the last year, there's been countless reports tying some of these think tanks and some of these advisors and influencers around the democratic machine to the Iranian government and to the IRGC and their network. So I think they have a flawed understanding of who we're dealing with. I think if these guys are seeing Rouhani and Zarif and Pezeshkian as reformists, then you're falling right into kind of the fool's trap of the regime. Yes, do we need a nuclear deal with Iran? 100% we do, but we need a good deal. A bad deal could be worse than no deal at all.